I cheated on my husband while he was in prison. Now I'm pregnant. Chapter 1. The Restless Void. Lauren had always believed her life was nearly perfect. She was married to a man, John, who adored her with every fiber of his being. Their love had blossomed during their college years, and from the moment they met, they had been inseparable. John was everything she could have ever wished for: handsome, successful, and, perhaps most importantly, he loved her unconditionally. He frequently called her affectionately after coming home from the golf club, where he spent his weekends working out, and his buff physique was the result of his dedication to fitness. He was everything anyone could ever ask for. But no matter how grateful Lauren felt, there was an emptiness gnawing at her from within. It was a feeling she couldn't quite explain. On the surface, everything seemed wonderful. Yet, deep down, she was haunted by the sense that something was missing. She never dared speak of it to John, fearing it would break the delicate balance of their marriage. This internal conflict was something she kept locked away, a dark secret that she hoped would eventually fade. Her best friend Jane, however, was always one to pry. Sitting across from her at a coffee shop one cloudy afternoon, Jane noticed Lauren's distracted gaze and furrowed brow. "Girl, what's wrong with you? You look like someone just stole your puppy," Jane teased, her voice playful yet probing. Lauren plastered on a smile, not wanting to dive into her feelings. "I'm fine, just a little disoriented, I guess." She took a sip of her latte, hoping to drown her unease in the warm liquid. "Disoriented?" Jane's eyebrow arched as she leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "Honey, you're married to the hottest guy in town, your house is like a mansion, and you've got the life every woman dreams of. What's going on in that pretty head of yours?" Lauren sighed, her walls starting to crack under the weight of Jane's persistence. "I don't know, Jane. I feel like I have everything I should want, but it's like there's this void I can't fill. It's not John's fault. He's perfect. It's me." Jane smirked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Sounds like you need a girls' night out. Let's hit the club, get a few drinks, and forget about your little existential crisis." Lauren laughed softly, shaking her head. "I haven't been to a club since my baccalaureate party. I don't think John would appreciate it if I started that up again." "John's not your babysitter," Jane quipped. "You're an adult, Lauren. You can have fun, too." After a moment of hesitation, Lauren caved in. "Fine, let's go tonight." As the day dragged on, Lauren felt a mix of excitement and guilt building inside her. She wasn't sure if she wanted to go out, or if she was simply desperate for a distraction. That evening, as she stood in front of her closet, staring at a row of dresses she hadn't worn in years, she wondered if she was about to make a huge mistake. Chapter 2. The Spark of Temptation. The club was a sensory overload, with neon lights flashing and the thump of bass vibrating through the floor. It had been so long since Lauren had been in such an environment that it felt foreign, almost surreal. Her heart pounded, not from the music, but from the uncertainty of what she was doing here. Jane, on the other hand, was in her element. She flitted through the crowd, greeting people like a queen returning to her kingdom. She dragged Lauren through the throng of bodies, finally finding them a spot near the bar. "Here," Jane handed her a drink, "something fruity. You'll like it." Lauren hesitated before taking a sip. It was sweet, tangy, and surprisingly refreshing. As the alcohol warmed her body, her nerves began to ease. Maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all. That's when she saw him. Tommy was sitting at the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey, his silver eyes shimmering under the dim lights. He was devastatingly handsome, in a rugged, untamed way that contrasted sharply with John's clean-cut, polished appearance. His gaze locked on Lauren, and her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, the world around her faded into the background, leaving just the two of them, tethered by an unspoken connection. He approached her, his smile disarming. "Hi," he said, his voice low and smooth, sending a shiver down her spine. Lauren swallowed hard, her mind racing. She was married. She loved her husband. But something about this man, about this moment, made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Hi," she replied, her voice barely audible over the music. They exchanged pleasantries, but Lauren barely registered the words. She was too focused on the way his eyes never left hers, the way his presence seemed to envelop her like a storm cloud ready to burst. He leaned in closer, and Lauren could feel the heat radiating from his body. Every instinct screamed at her to step away, to leave, to go home to John where she belonged. But she didn't. Instead, she found herself leaning into him, her body betraying her mind. When his lips finally brushed against hers, it was like a dam breaking. Fireworks exploded behind her eyes, and all the guilt, all the doubt, evaporated in that moment of pure, unbridled passion. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a spark, a dangerous, forbidden spark that threatened to ignite a fire she wasn't sure she could control. Chapter 3. A Taste of Sin. Lauren woke the next morning to the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Her head throbbed, and her body ached in ways that had nothing to do with alcohol. She blinked, disoriented, before her eyes landed on the man lying beside her. Tommy. The events of the previous night came rushing back in a dizzying flood. The kiss, the way they had sneaked away to a private VIP room. The way he had undressed her, his touch lighting her skin on fire. The way she had abandoned every thought of John, of her marriage, of the life she had built, all for the fleeting pleasure of a night with a stranger. Lauren's heart raced as she sat up, pulling the sheet around her naked body. What had she done? She glanced at Tommy, who was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. He looked so content, so utterly unaware of the turmoil raging inside her. She slipped out of bed as quietly as she could, gathering her clothes from the floor. Her hands trembled as she dressed, her mind screaming at her for what she had done. How could she have been so reckless, so selfish? As she made her way out of the room, her phone buzzed in her purse. She fished it out, her stomach flipping when she saw John's name on the screen. "Good morning, babe. Hope you're having a nice day. Miss you." Lauren's heart sank. How could she face him after this? How could she ever look him in the eyes again, knowing what she had done? She shoved the phone back in her purse and hurried out of the club, her thoughts a whirlwind of guilt, shame, and a terrifying realization. Despite everything, she didn't regret it. And that scared her more than anything. Chapter 4. Torn Between Two Worlds. Lauren's ride home was suffocatingly quiet, the cityscape outside the car window blurring into a kaleidoscope of neon lights and shadows. Each streetlight that passed seemed to spotlight her guilt, intensifying the weight pressing down on her chest. Her thoughts spiraled, moving between shame and a strange, nagging sense of exhilaration. She knew she should feel only guilt, pure, unfiltered guilt for what she had done to John. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something darker, more primal. Tommy's touch was still fresh on her skin, the heat of their stolen moments lingering, taunting her. She hadn't felt desire like that in years. John was kind, attentive, loving, but their intimacy had become routine, a comfortable pattern that left her yearning for something more, something that stirred her soul in ways she couldn't admit to herself. The cab pulled into her driveway, and Lauren stared at the house. It was a picture-perfect suburban dream, complete with a white picket fence and a blooming garden carefully tended by John on the weekends. Everything was in its place, exactly as it should be. But as she stepped out of the car and made her way to the front door, she felt like an intruder in her own life. She unlocked the door quietly, slipping inside without turning on the lights. John was still asleep, his soft snores drifting down the hallway, and for a moment, Lauren stood frozen, her hand on the doorframe, listening. Her heart ached with guilt. John didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve her betrayal. In the dim light of the hallway, Lauren tiptoed toward the bathroom, hoping a shower would wash away the lingering traces of the night. As the hot water cascaded over her body, she closed her eyes, but all she could see was Tommy's face, his hands, the way he had devoured her with an intensity she hadn't known she craved. She felt a wave of shame rising in her chest, but it was accompanied by something else, arousal. Her mind betrayed her as images of the previous night flooded back. The way Tommy had pulled her into him, the way he had whispered filthy promises in her ear, the way he had made her feel alive again, if only for a moment. The water couldn't cleanse her conscience, and as she stepped out of the shower, she caught her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized herself. There was a wildness in her eyes, a hunger that hadn't been there before. As she crawled into bed beside John, careful not to wake him, she felt the distance between them more acutely than ever. His body was warm and familiar, but it wasn't enough to soothe the ache inside her. She turned away from him, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could keep living this double life. Chapter 5. A Dangerous Addiction. Days passed, and Lauren tried to push Tommy out of her mind, but it was futile. She was consumed by thoughts of him, the way his hands had moved over her body, the way he had ignited something in her that she had thought long extinguished. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. Every time John touched her, she found herself comparing his tenderness to Tommy's raw, unrestrained passion. It became a dangerous game. She told herself she wouldn't go back, that she wouldn't contact him again. But the pull was irresistible. Every day she found herself staring at her phone, her thumb hovering over Tommy's number, torn between desire and guilt. She would type out a message, her heart racing with anticipation, only to delete it before hitting send. But one night, when John was working late and the house felt too empty, too quiet, she gave in. Her fingers moved of their own accord, typing out a simple message. "Can we meet again?" Her heart pounded as she waited for his response, the seconds dragging out into what felt like hours. When his reply finally came, her pulse quickened. "Thought you'd never ask. My place this time?" Lauren knew she should say no. She should delete the message, block his number, and move on with her life. But instead, she found herself typing out a response. "Okay, send me the address." The moment she hit send, her stomach twisted with guilt, but it was too late. She was already in too deep. Later that night, she found herself standing outside Tommy's apartment, her heart racing. She hadn't felt this nervous the first time, but now, the weight of what she was doing pressed down on her like a lead blanket. She knocked on the door, and when Tommy opened it, his eyes darkened with desire the moment he saw her. "Come in," he said, his voice low, his smile predatory. Lauren hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her fate. Chapter 6. Forbidden Passion. Tommy's apartment was a far cry from the pristine, meticulously maintained home she shared with John. It was messy, cluttered, lived in a way that felt both chaotic and freeing. There were piles of books and papers scattered across the floor, dishes stacked in the sink, and the faint smell of whiskey lingering in the air. It was nothing like the life she had built with John, and yet it felt like an escape, like stepping into another world where the rules didn't apply. Tommy wasted no time. The moment she was inside, he was on her, his hands rough and insistent, pulling her close, his lips crashing against hers with an urgency that made her knees weak. Lauren's mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But her body responded instinctively, melting into him, craving the fire that only he seemed able to ignite. As his hands moved over her body, his touch more aggressive than before, Lauren's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but the thrill of it was intoxicating. Tommy wasn't like John. He didn't treat her like something delicate, something to be protected. He wanted her raw and unfiltered, and that made her feel more alive than she had in years. They moved to the bedroom in a blur of tangled limbs and feverish kisses. Tommy's hands were everywhere, pulling, tugging, claiming her as his own. Lauren's thoughts became a jumbled mess of desire and guilt, the two emotions warring within her. But in that moment, desire won. As they collapsed onto the bed, Tommy's weight pressing down on her, Lauren's breath hitched. Her heart raced, not just from the physical sensation, but from the knowledge that she was crossing a line she could never uncross. Chapter 7. Guilt and Desire Collide. The next morning, Lauren awoke in a tangle of sheets and limbs. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over Tommy's bare chest. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to linger in the peace of the morning. His body pressed against hers, the sense of reckless freedom that had consumed her the night before still tingling on her skin. But as the haze of sleep began to clear, reality came rushing back. The thrill of the night before faded into a creeping sense of dread. What had she done? How had she let it go this far? Tommy stirred beside her, his hand absent-mindedly brushing against her hip, and the intimacy of the gesture sent a chill through her. She slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake him, and dressed in silence. Her hands shook as she pulled her shirt over her head. She felt dirty, not just physically but emotionally. The guilt was overwhelming now, suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her chest. John's face flashed in her mind, his gentle smile, the way he kissed her forehead every morning before work. The thought of him twisted her stomach into knots. Lauren glanced back at Tommy, still sleeping soundly, his face relaxed in the morning light. He looked so different like this, vulnerable, almost innocent, a stark contrast to the wild passion he had unleashed in her. Part of her wanted to stay, to lose herself in him again, but she knew she couldn't. Not this time. She left his apartment without saying goodbye, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she hurried out into the cold morning air. The chill hit her like a slap, shocking her back to reality. She hailed a cab and gave the driver her home address, her heart pounding in her chest the entire ride. When she arrived home, the house was quiet. John was still at work. Lauren sat on the couch, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She stared at the screen for what felt like hours, debating whether to text Tommy, to tell him that last night was a mistake, that it couldn't happen again. But she didn't. Instead, she tossed her phone onto the coffee table and buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of guilt and confusion. Chapter 8. The Slippery Slope. Days turned into weeks, and despite her guilt, Lauren couldn't stay away from Tommy. Each time she told herself it was the last time, that she wouldn't fall into his arms again, she found herself drawn back to him, as if by some magnetic force. Their affair became a dark addiction, each secret meeting leaving her more torn between the life she had with John and the dangerous thrill Tommy offered her. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, but so did the desire. Every time she saw John, the weight of her betrayal grew heavier, yet the excitement of sneaking around behind his back only fueled her reckless behavior. She hated herself for it, but the fire between her and Tommy was impossible to ignore. It consumed her, burning brighter with each illicit encounter. Tommy was intoxicating in a way that made her forget the consequences, if only for a while. His touch ignited something primal in her, something that John, with all his kindness and stability, could never reach. Tommy made her feel alive, dangerous, like she was living on the edge of something thrilling and terrifying all at once. But the deeper she fell into her affair, the more unstable her world became. John began to notice the cracks. He wasn't blind to the way Lauren had been acting lately, the late nights, the distant look in her eyes, the forced smiles. He would ask if everything was okay, his voice tinged with concern, but Lauren always brushed him off with a reassuring lie. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, John reached across to take her hand. His touch was soft, familiar, but it made Lauren flinch. She quickly covered it with a forced smile, but John's eyes narrowed, his brow furrowing with suspicion. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice gentle but probing. "Is everything all right? Are you happy, Lauren?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Was she happy? The answer was far more complicated than she could admit. She loved John, but her heart was tangled in knots, split between the stability of her marriage and the dangerous allure of Tommy. How could she explain that without unraveling everything? "I'm fine, really," she said, pulling her hand away to take a sip of her wine. "Just work stress, you know. I've been feeling overwhelmed lately." John didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. He simply nodded and returned to his meal, though the atmosphere between them remained thick with unspoken tension. Lauren felt a lump forming in her throat. She hated lying to him, but telling him the truth would shatter everything. Chapter 9. An Unexpected Revelation. One afternoon, after another heated rendezvous with Tommy, Lauren began feeling ill. It was a wave of nausea that struck suddenly, leaving her weak and dizzy. She brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the stress of living a double life catching up with her. But when the sickness persisted for days, a sinking feeling of dread settled in her stomach. Could it be? No, it couldn't. She dismissed the thought, trying to convince herself that it was just a passing bug. But deep down, a part of her already knew. She avoided Tommy for a few days, hoping that the nausea would go away, but it didn't. And then, when she missed her period, the reality hit her with full force. She was pregnant. The realization left her reeling. Panic surged through her, followed by an overwhelming wave of confusion. Whose baby was it? John's or Tommy's? The thought twisted her stomach into knots, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of the mess she had created. If it was John's, maybe she could salvage her marriage, pretend that everything was fine. But if it was Tommy's, her entire life would unravel. Lauren stared at the positive pregnancy test, her hands trembling. What was she going to do? She couldn't tell John. Not yet. She needed to figure out whose baby it was, and more importantly, what she was going to do next. But there was no easy way out of this. She knew she couldn't avoid Tommy forever. He had been texting her, asking why she had been so distant, but she hadn't replied. Not until now. "Can we talk?" She typed, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's important." Chapter 10. The truth comes out. When Lauren met Tommy later that night, she could barely look him in the eye. They sat in the dimly lit corner of a bar, the tension between them palpable. Tommy reached across the table to touch her hand, but Lauren pulled away, her stomach churning with anxiety. "What's going on?" Tommy asked, his brow furrowed in concern. "You've been acting weird. Is everything all right?" Lauren swallowed hard, her throat dry. She took a deep breath before blurting out the truth. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Tommy's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he said nothing. Lauren could see the panic flickering in his eyes, and it mirrored her own. "Is it mine?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "I don't know," Lauren admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It could be yours, or John's. I don't know." Tommy leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a crushing force. Chapter 11. A Web of Deceit. The silence between Lauren and Tommy felt like an eternity, each passing second stretching into an uncomfortable silence that neither of them knew how to break. Finally, Tommy leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "What are we going to do?" Lauren shook her head, her thoughts racing. "I don't know. I can't tell John yet. I need to figure things out first. We can't just drop this on him. It would ruin everything." "Everything is already ruined," Tommy exclaimed, his frustration bubbling over. "You can't keep living this lie, Lauren. You have to decide what you want." "I want to make it work with John," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "But I can't give up what we have either. You make me feel alive. But I love John, I do." Tommy's expression hardened, his jaw clenched. "So you're just going to keep stringing me along while you figure out your life? What about me? What do I get out of this?" The anger in his voice stung, and Lauren felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "It's not like that. You know it's complicated. I never intended for any of this to happen." Tommy leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his expression turning cold. "I can't just sit around waiting for you to make up your mind. If you're going to stay with John, then just say it." The confrontation made her heart race. "I can't just abandon what I have with John, Tommy. He doesn't deserve this." "But neither do I," he shot back, his frustration palpable. "I deserve to know where we stand." Lauren felt the walls closing in on her, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to think, to escape the suffocating atmosphere. "I can't do this right now," she said, rising from her seat. "I need space." "Fine," Tommy replied, his tone icy. "But know that I won't wait forever." As she left the bar, Lauren felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The air outside was thick with tension, and she didn't know where to turn. In her mind, thoughts of John and Tommy clashed violently. She loved John, but she craved the passion and excitement Tommy brought into her life. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. Days turned into a blur as Lauren wrestled with her feelings and the growing weight of her secret. The tension at home with John became unbearable. She could see the worry in his eyes as he tried to reach out to her, but she felt so distant, like a ghost haunting her own life. He was kind, attentive, and completely unaware of the turmoil raging within her. One evening, while John prepared dinner, Lauren stared blankly out the window, lost in thought. The sunlight cast a warm glow over the kitchen, but she felt cold inside. When John called her to the table, she snapped back to reality, forcing a smile as she joined him. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone hopeful. "It was fine," she lied, taking a bite of the meal he had prepared. The taste felt bland and unappealing. "You seem a bit off. Are you sure everything is okay?" he pressed, concern etching his features. She wanted to tell him everything, to be honest, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she shrugged and forced a laugh. Just tired, I guess. John nodded, though his expression didn't fully ease. He reached across the table to hold her hand, and Lauren felt a pang of guilt wash over her. She looked into his eyes, and all she could see was the love and trust he had for her, trust she was shattering piece by piece. As the days passed, Lauren's emotional turmoil intensified. The nausea persisted, and the fear of the unknown consumed her. She avoided Tommy, her heart conflicted, but the more she tried to push him away, the more she felt drawn to him. Then one night, unable to resist any longer, she found herself outside Tommy's apartment, her heart racing. She knocked on the door, and when he opened it, his expression shifted from surprise to something darker. "You came back," he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. "I need to talk," she said, stepping inside, her heart pounding in her chest. Tommy closed the door behind her, and she could feel the tension crackling in the air. "You've been avoiding me. Is it because of John?" Lauren swallowed hard, her throat dry. "It's complicated, Tommy. I'm pregnant." His expression darkened, and he stepped closer, invading her space. "Is it mine?" "I don't know," she exclaimed, frustration spilling over. "I'm scared, Tommy. I don't know what to do." "You need to figure it out," he said, his voice suddenly fierce. "You need to choose, Lauren. You can't keep living in this limbo." The words echoed in her mind, a harsh reminder of the reality she was trying to avoid. She felt the weight of his gaze, the intensity making her heart race. Part of her craved this dangerous, reckless passion, but the other part of her was terrified of the consequences. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I want you to be honest with yourself," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "You need to decide what you truly want. I can't keep being your secret." Lauren felt a surge of emotions, anger, fear, desire, all crashing together in a chaotic whirlwind. "I want you, but I can't just throw away my life with John." "Then what are you going to do?" Tommy asked, his voice laced with urgency. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from John. "I'm worried about you. Can we talk?" The reminder of her double life made her stomach twist with guilt. She looked at Tommy, who was watching her with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. "I need to go," she said, stepping back. "I can't do this right now." As she turned to leave, she could feel Tommy's gaze burning into her back. "You can't run away from this, Lauren. You have to face it." But Lauren didn't stop. She rushed out of the apartment, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of her choices pressing down harder than ever. Chapter 13. A Desperate Decision. That night, Lauren lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. John was sleeping peacefully beside her, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Guilt washed over her in waves, crashing against the shore of her consciousness. She could feel the baby growing inside her, a constant reminder of the choices she had made. As she turned over, she felt a sharp pain in her stomach, a sudden reminder of the stress she had been under. The thought of telling John the truth gnawed at her, but how could she shatter his world? The fear of losing him paralyzed her, keeping her trapped in her own web of deceit. Then came a knock at the door. Lauren's heart raced as she got out of bed, unsure of who it could be. When she opened the door, she found Tommy standing there, his expression unreadable. "Tommy," she whispered, stepping back to let him in. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't wait any longer," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to talk. This can't go on." She glanced nervously back at the bedroom, fearing John might wake up and discover the truth. "Not now. We can't do this here." "Why not?" "You need to make a decision, Lauren. You can't keep living a lie." His anger fueled her own frustration, and she felt the walls closing in around her. "I can't just choose between you two like it's some game. This is my life, and I'm scared." "Then stop running," he shouted, his voice echoing in the silence of the hallway. "Face it, you have to choose." Before she could respond, John appeared at the bedroom door, rubbing his eyes in confusion. "What's going on?" The sight of John sent a wave of panic through Lauren. She could see the worry etched on his face, and the last thing she wanted was to drag him into the chaos of her life. Nothing," she stammered, her heart racing. "Tommy just stopped by to drop off something." John's gaze shifted between them, suspicion creeping into his expression. "Is everything okay?" Tommy stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Actually, John, we need to talk. About Lauren. What? John's eyes narrowed, and Lauren felt the tension crackle between the three of them. Stay out of this, Lauren interjected, stepping between them. This isn't what it looks like. Then what is it? John demanded, his voice rising. Because it looks like you're hiding something from me. Stop, Lauren shouted, feeling overwhelmed. Just stop. This isn't the time or place for this. But Tommy took a step forward, ignoring her plea. You deserve to know the truth, John. Lauren's been living a lie. John's expression darkened as the weight of Tommy's words sank in. What do you mean? What are you saying? She's pregnant, Tommy said, his voice low and tense. And she doesn't know who the father is. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. John's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. What? Is this true? Lauren felt the ground slip out from under her as John's gaze turned from Tommy to her, searching for answers she didn't have. Lauren, is this true? He pressed, his voice trembling. I didn't want to tell you like this, she stammered, tears pricking at her eyes. I was going to figure it out first. Figure what out? John's voice rose in anger. You've been cheating on me, and now you're pregnant. How could you do this? Don't make this worse. Lauren cried, her heart pounding. I love you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But the damage was done. The trust between them shattered in an instant, and she could see the hurt in John's eyes, the betrayal cutting deep. You love me? He scoffed, disbelief etched on his face. How can you say that after what you've done? I made a mistake, Lauren said, desperation clawing at her. I was lost, and I didn't know how to handle it. Lost? John's voice dripped with sarcasm. You think that justifies cheating on your husband? On me? Tommy stepped closer, his presence looming over them. You both need to face the truth. This isn't just about you two anymore. You don't get to dictate how this goes, John spat, turning his fury on Tommy. This is between me and my wife. And look where that's gotten you, Tommy shot back. You're about to lose her because you're too blind to see what's happening. Enough, Lauren shouted, feeling the walls closing in around her. This isn't helping. We need to figure out what to do. You have a choice to make, Tommy said, his voice low. You can choose him, or you can choose me. Chapter 14. The Climax of Chaos. The air was thick with tension as Lauren stood between the two men she had betrayed. She felt trapped, a pawn in a game she never wanted to play. Her heart raced as she weighed her options, each choice feeling heavier than the last. How can you even ask me to choose? She shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't just throw away everything with John, but I can't deny what I feel for you either. Then figure it out, Tommy yelled, his voice rising. You can't keep stringing us along while you pretend everything is fine. Maybe it's time you both face the consequences of your choices, John said coldly, his expression hardening. You think I don't see what's happening here. You think I'm just going to stand by while you two play house. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. John's hurt and betrayal stung deep, and the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She had lost sight of everything she had ever cared about in the pursuit of fleeting passion. I didn't mean for this to happen, she pleaded, her voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt you, John. But he shook his head, anger and disappointment flickering in his eyes. You did, Lauren. You hurt me in ways I never thought possible. Suddenly, the tension reached a breaking point. Tommy stepped forward, his eyes locked on John. You're not the only one hurting here. This is my life too. In a flash, everything exploded. John surged forward, fury igniting within him. You don't get to dictate what happens here, Tommy. Stay away from my wife. Before Lauren could react, John and Tommy were grappling with each other, fists flying as emotions boiled over. She watched in horror, her heart pounding as they fought, the chaotic energy consuming the room. Stop it, both of you. Lauren screamed, but her words were drowned out by the sound of fists connecting with flesh. In a moment of pure instinct, she reached for the golf club that John kept by the front door for emergencies, her mind racing. She needed to stop this, to regain control of the situation before it spiraled completely out of hand. Get off him, she shouted, swinging the club at Tommy just as he landed a punch on John. The impact knocked him away, and for a moment, both men froze, shocked by the sudden violence. Lauren, what the hell? Tommy gasped, stepping back, but the shock only fueled her anger. "You both need to listen to me," she yelled, brandishing the club like a weapon. "This isn't helping anyone." But her heart was pounding for another reason entirely. She felt the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins, the power of the moment overwhelming her. "I'm pregnant. I don't want this fight. I don't want either of you to hurt each other or me." John's expression shifted, a mix of anger and confusion flickering across his face. "You think swinging a golf club is going to fix this? You're the one who caused all of this." "I know," she cried, the weight of her choices crashing down on her. "But I'm still here, trying to figure it out. I don't want to lose either of you." As the reality of her words settled in, the intensity of the moment seemed to freeze. The chaos around them faded, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. But then, John's anger resurfaced, and he lunged at Tommy again, their fight reigniting in a flurry of movement. Desperation surged through Lauren as she tried to separate them, swinging the club again. In a split second, her aim was off, and the club connected with John's head. The sickening thud echoed through the room, and John fell to the ground, unconscious. "John!" Lauren screamed, rushing to his side, her heart racing. She dropped the golf club, panic flooding her system as she knelt beside him. "Oh God, what have I done?" Tommy stood frozen, shock plastered across his face as he processed what had just happened. "Lauren, what did you do?" "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to stop the fight," she cried, tears streaming down her face as she checked John for any sign of consciousness. But he lay there, still and unresponsive. Chapter 15: Consequences and Choices. The weight of the moment crashed down on Lauren, her heart pounding in her chest as she shook John gently, desperation clawing at her. "John, please, wake up." But he didn't move, and panic surged through her. Tommy crouched down beside her, his face a mask of concern. "We need to call an ambulance." "No," Lauren exclaimed, shaking her head. "I can't. What'll they think? I can't let them know about this." "What are you talking about? He needs help," Tommy urged, his voice frantic. "I can't have them know about the baby. What if it's yours?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted them. Tommy's expression shifted, hurt flickering in his eyes. "This isn't the time for that, Lauren. We need to get him help." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at John's still form. She had never meant for any of this to happen. The mess she had created was spiraling out of control, and now she was facing the consequences of her choices. "I can't lose him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He doesn't deserve this." Tommy's hand on her shoulder brought her back to reality. "What do you want to do? You need to make a choice." "I want to fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to save John." With determination surging through her, Lauren took a deep breath and reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. She had to make things right, even if it meant facing the fallout of her actions. As the operator answered, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now she would have to face the consequences. Chapter 16: The Reckoning. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Lauren watched in a daze as paramedics rushed into the apartment. They quickly assessed John, checking for signs of consciousness while she stood frozen, guilt and fear flooding her. "What happened?" one of the paramedics asked, looking at her and then at Tommy, who remained nearby, his expression tense. "It was an accident," Lauren stammered, her heart racing. "We were just arguing, and I didn't mean to hit him." As the paramedics worked, Tommy moved closer to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said automatically, though the panic gnawed at her insides. Her focus remained on John, whose unconscious form felt like a weight on her chest. They loaded John onto a stretcher, and Lauren felt a surge of helplessness wash over her. She needed to go with him, to make sure he was okay. "I want to go with him," she insisted, her voice rising in urgency. "You can ride in the ambulance," one of the paramedics said, glancing back at her, "but you need to stay calm." With a nod, she climbed into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut behind her. Tommy stood outside, his expression a mix of anger and confusion, but she couldn't focus on that now. All she could think about was John, and how she had put him in this position. As they rushed through the city, sirens blaring, Lauren sat beside John, holding his hand tightly. She whispered promises and apologies, praying he would wake up and forgive her. When they arrived at the hospital, a flurry of activity surrounded her. Doctors and nurses rushed past, and she felt overwhelmed by the chaos. They wheeled John into a treatment room, and Lauren was left waiting in the sterile hallway, anxiety eating away at her. Hours passed, each minute stretching into an eternity. She paced the waiting room, her heart racing as she replayed the events over and over in her mind. The guilt was suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had ruined everything. Finally, a doctor approached her, and her heart sank. "Mrs. Thompson." "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Your husband is stable, but he sustained a concussion. He's going to need time to recover." "Can I see him?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Yes, but please remember he may be disoriented when he wakes up," the doctor warned. Lauren nodded, her heart aching as she followed the doctor to John's room. When she entered, her breath caught in her throat. He lay there, looking so vulnerable, and she felt a wave of emotion crash over her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen." John stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. Confusion clouded his gaze as he looked at her. "Lauren," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I'm here," she said, taking his hand. "I'm so sorry. I love you. I didn't want to hurt you." He blinked slowly, his expression shifting as he processed her words. "What happened?" he asked, struggling to sit up. "You were hurt during a fight." I hit you at the golf club," she admitted, the weight of her confession heavy on her heart. His eyes widened in shock. "Why?" "Because I couldn't stand seeing you hurt. I thought I could stop it, but it all spiraled out of control," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe this," he said, pain etched across his features. "You've been cheating on me." "I was lost," she sobbed. "I made mistakes, but I love you, John. I want to fix this." "You've broken my trust," he replied, his voice cold. "How can I believe anything you say now?" "Because I'm willing to fight for us," she pleaded, desperation seeping into her words. "I want to make things right." But deep down, she knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. The damage was done, and the consequences of her choices loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. Chapter 17. The aftermath days turned into weeks as John recovered from his concussion, and Lauren's guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the mess she had made. John was distant, the warmth in his eyes replaced by uncertainty. They tried to pick up the pieces, but the weight of betrayal hung heavily between them. Tommy had been silent since the incident, and part of her was grateful for the distance. She needed time to focus on her marriage, to figure out how to regain John's trust. But the ache for Tommy lingered in the back of her mind, a constant reminder of the thrill she had craved. One evening, as she cleaned the kitchen, she felt her phone buzz on the counter. A message from Tommy flashed on the screen. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, heart racing. What could he possibly want to say? She stared at the message, torn between her past and her present. The decision felt monumental, and her heart raced as she weighed the options. After a few moments of contemplation, she finally replied, "Okay." "Where?" They agreed to meet at a nearby cafe, and the moment she walked in, she spotted Tommy at a corner table, his expression unreadable. As she approached, her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and dread. "Hey," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Hey," he replied, his tone guarded. "How's John?" "He's recovering, but it's tough." "We're trying to figure things out," she admitted, her gaze shifting to her hands as they rested on the table. "Are you happy?" Tommy asked, piercing through her defenses. "I don't know," she said honestly, frustration bubbling up inside her. "I don't know what I want anymore. Everything feels so messed up." "You know you can talk to me," he said, leaning closer. "You don't have to hide your feelings." "But I do," she snapped, emotions flaring. "Because I made a commitment to John. I can't just throw that away." "Then why are you here?" he pressed, his eyes searching hers. "You know what I feel for you, Lauren. I don't want to be just the other guy." She felt the weight of his words sinking in, the truth of her situation crashing over her. "I don't want you to be," she whispered, "but I don't want to hurt John either." Tommy leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You're stuck in the middle, and it's killing you. You need to decide what you want." "I don't want to choose," she said, her voice trembling. I just want everything to go back to normal. But that's not going to happen, Tommy replied, his tone firm. You have to face the reality of your choices. You can't keep living like this. The truth hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the weight of her decisions pressed down on her. She felt trapped between two worlds, each one pulling her in a different direction. What if I choose wrong? She whispered, fear creeping into her voice. What if I lose everything? Then you fight for it, Tommy said, his expression softening. But you have to be honest with yourself, Lauren. You can't keep running away from the truth. As they sat in silence, she felt the weight of his gaze on her, the intensity of his emotions colliding with her own. She needed to make a choice, and the reality of her situation crashed down around her like a tidal wave. Chapter 18. The Moment of Truth. Back at home, Lauren felt the familiar knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. John was in the living room, watching TV, and the sight of him filled her with a mix of love and guilt. She had to be honest with him, but the fear of losing him paralyzed her. Taking a deep breath, she joined him on the couch. Can we talk? He glanced at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. About what? About us, she said, her heart racing. I need to be honest with you about everything that's happened. John set the remote down, his expression shifting to concern. Okay, I'm listening. I've been seeing someone else, she admitted, her voice shaking. Tommy, I didn't mean for it to happen, but I was lost and Why now? He interrupted, his voice low and tense. Why are you telling me this now? Because I need you to know the truth, she pleaded, her heart pounding. I'm pregnant, and I don't know who the father is. The words hung heavy in the air, and she watched as John's face fell, the hurt evident in his eyes. You expect me to just accept that? I didn't want any of this, she cried, tears streaming down her face. I love you, John. I want to make this work, but I need you to understand how messed up everything is right now. You can't expect me to just forgive you, he said, his voice tight. This is a lot to take in. I know, she said, desperation clawing at her throat. But I can't keep living a lie. I need you to know the truth so we can figure out what to do next. Next? John scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. You think there's a next after this? You've shattered my trust. I want to fight for us, she said, reaching for his hand. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. How can I believe anything you say? He asked, pain etched across his features. You've already betrayed me once. What's stopping you from doing it again? Because I don't want to lose you, she said, her voice breaking. I need you in my life. I want to be a family. He pulled his hand away, his expression cold. You've already made your choices, Lauren. Now you have to face the consequences. The truth of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The reality of her situation crashed down around her, and for the first time, she truly understood the gravity of her actions. Chapter 19. The breaking point days passed, each one feeling heavier than the last as Lauren navigated the fallout of her choices. John was distant, the warmth between them replaced by an icy silence. She felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her, and guilt gnawed at her insides. One night, as she lay in bed, she felt a familiar stirring in her heart. It was Tommy, the thrill of his presence, still lingering in her mind. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she debated whether to reach out. Finally, she sent him a message. Can we talk? Minutes later, her phone buzzed. Yes, tomorrow? As they met at the cafe, Lauren felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Tommy was the only one who truly understood her, but being with him also meant risking everything she had with John. Hey, she said as she slid into the booth across from him. Hey, he replied, his eyes searching hers. How are you holding up? It's hard, she admitted, looking down at her hands. John is still so angry, and I don't know how to fix this. You have to be honest with him about how you feel, Tommy said, his tone steady. You can't keep living this lie. I know, she said, frustration bubbling inside her. But I don't want to hurt him any more than I already have. But you're hurting yourself by not being true to what you want, he replied, leaning closer. You need to figure out what's really in your heart. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, the truth of his words striking a chord deep within. She had to make a choice, and the longer she waited, the more tangled her emotions became. What if I choose wrong? she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. You won't know unless you try, he said softly. You deserve to be happy, Lauren. You can't keep living for someone else. As the words sank in, she felt a surge of determination. She needed to confront the reality of her situation, to finally face her choices head-on. But as the truth loomed closer, so did the fear of losing everything she had ever known. Chapter 20. The Resolution. The following week, Lauren sat in the living room, the atmosphere thick with tension. John walked in, his expression guarded. She could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air, and she knew she needed to take the leap. Can we talk? She asked, her heart racing. He nodded, but his eyes remained distant. What is there to talk about? I need to be honest with you about my feelings, he said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I care about Tommy, but I want you in my life. I don't know what to do, but I can't keep living in this limbo. John's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and anger crossing his face. So, you want both of us? I don't want to hurt either of you, she said, her voice trembling. But I can't pretend like everything is fine when it's not. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. You've already hurt me, Lauren. How can I trust you again? I'm willing to fight for us, she said, desperation creeping in. I want to figure this out together. But how? He asked, pain evident in his eyes. How can we move forward after everything that's happened? I don't know, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. But I want to try. I want to be a family. Silence enveloped them, the weight of their choices pressing down like a heavy shroud. As she looked into John's eyes, she felt the turmoil of emotions swirl within her, the fear of losing everything warring with the desire to make things right. Finally, John took a deep breath, his gaze steadying. If we're going to try, we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets. Agreed, she said, hope flickering in her heart. We can do this, we just need to communicate. But as they navigated their emotions, the reality of their situation hung heavy in the air. Lauren knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she felt a sense of clarity. She wanted to fight for what she believed in, to reclaim the love she had once taken for granted. As they began to rebuild their relationship, she couldn't shake the lingering thoughts of Tommy. He had been a part of her life, and she couldn't simply erase that connection. But for now, she had to focus on the path ahead with John, knowing that the consequences of her choices would ripple through their lives. In the end, Lauren found herself at a crossroads, torn between two worlds. She had to decide what she truly wanted and be willing to face the fallout. But one thing was certain, she would never take love for granted again. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready to fight for the life she truly desired. Epilogue. Months passed, and as Lauren navigated the complexities of her choices, she found strength in vulnerability. John had slowly begun to heal, and they were learning to communicate openly, addressing the hurt that lingered between them. Trust was slowly being rebuilt, one conversation at a time. But in the back of her mind, the shadow of Tommy lingered. They had agreed to stay apart, but the connection they shared still tugged at her heart. She knew that she couldn't erase that part of her life, but she had to focus on the present. One evening, as she sat on the porch, feeling the cool breeze against her skin, she glanced at her phone. A message from Tommy flashed on the screen. I miss you. Her heart raced, the thrill of his words igniting a familiar spark within her. She stared at the screen, contemplating her next move. The choice lay before her, a reminder of the life she had once lived. But for now, she chose to focus on the family she was building with John. She took a deep breath, letting go of the past as she embraced the possibilities of the future. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face whatever came next, one day at a time.